Hi, my name is Lorraine Watry and welcome to my studio. I am a watercolor artist and I've worked with watercolor for 26 years now, and I thought I would start a new series of videos where I go over different tips, tricks, and techniques for working with watercolor. And hopefully these short videos will help you in your journey, and if you have a question or a technique that you would like to see, please comment below and I will try to accommodate that in a future video. Today's tip and trick video is going to go over how to paint trees that are in the background. I had a question from one of my viewers and they asked if there is some method of creating those trees. So I thought I would go over a little variety of some of the images that I had on hand. And so this is aspen trees, so deciduous leaves, and these trees are a little farther in the background than one that you would be right up next to that you can see every leaf. And then I have one here with some trees in the foreground that are a little grouped together, and then some trees in the background and on the hillside back here. And then in this image there are more trees kind of in the mid-ground here, and then some even farther back, and there's some texture and things in there. So I'll go ahead and start from the left and work that direction. And I had some colors out on my palette already that were in the green range, and so I'll go ahead and use that. So sometimes the trees that you see are going to be, if you squint at your photograph, if you squint and you can make basically a value shape, so there's a big dark shadow up in here on this area, and then there's some lighter trees in there, then I would just paint it in as a value. I wouldn't think of it as each individual tree. So I'm going to pull out some of my ultramarine blue. And I already had some out here earlier, and I had mixed it with the quinacridone gold. And the background trees are going to generally be cooler and more muted. So I'm going to make a kind of evergreen color, that's quin gold, that I'm getting on my brush. And I'll use some of what I had there before, and then I actually want to pull out a little more of my burnt sienna. And the burnt sienna I will use to neutralize my mix a little bit. It will make it not as vibrant a mix is what neutralizing it means, or graying it down. You might also hear that term. And so I'm going to quickly pull that out, and I have, I think I want to put just a touch more quin gold over here, and then I'll use a little bit of the burnt sienna with it. And so the first color that I'm going to put down will be the lighter value that's up in here, and I will just back that up a little bit. I will just place that in the background, and that's a little too warm still, so I'm going to add some of my ultramarine to that mix, and maybe even a little more of the burnt sienna. Okay. And so right now I am painting that whole background with some of that color, and then I will come back over it with some of the darker value for the shadows that are back there. And I also think as I'm coming down, I'm going to put a little water in here to lighten this section just a little more. So it was a little too dark for what I wanted. So right now I am basically painting that tone over that whole area. And these are just little studies. I am not thinking of this as a completed painting. So this is just a way to try colors and to try your process. So I'm just doing these as quick little examples. And I didn't spend very much time on the drawing either. I just did some quick little sketches so I'd have an image to go by. Okay, so And this area then would need to dry. So I'm going to leave that for a few minutes. And I did not come down, so when I was doing this image, and I'll just kind of show the side camera here, when I was doing this image, I did not paint these trees right here. I just painted the background trees, and I stopped. Right here is the top of those trees that are a little lighter. So I'm going to leave that and let it dry, and I'll go over and do a little on this one. So that is trees that are really far back, but you might still see, if you looked really closely, you might still see individual trees, and that's just the base coat. The next one, there are some of that same thing going on. These are even farther back than these trees, but I'm going to do the trees that are back in here. And those trees are, they become basically one big shape. So you don't have to paint each individual tree. When you see something like that, you can just paint across the shape. I will be painting them on dry paper. I painted this on dry paper as well. It was small enough that I could get across the whole area without it drying and causing lines and things. And this is the same thing where I can slowly paint across it. And I would have, at this point, I would have more of the landscape in. Those background values and things that are on the hills, I would have that color in. I would probably have some of the lighter trees in the foreground. Because this is darker value back here, this would be part of the painting that I would do later on. I would not start with this if I were doing this painting, just so that you know. And so as you can see, I'm painting around the foreground trees. So imagine these trees right here would already have color on them. And I am going ahead and giving the upper edge of these trees a little variety in height, because I don't want them all to be the same height. There would be some variation. The one thing to be careful of is generally, and it's not necessarily true for every landscape, but generally your background trees are going to be shorter than the foreground trees. So you wouldn't want to necessarily see a tree that's going to be really tall back here compared to what is in your foreground. That would perspectively not make sense. And as I'm moving across the shape, across the paper back there, I am adjusting my color a little bit. So sometimes it's a little bluer, and then sometimes I go back over into the Quin Gold and I make it a little greener because I add more of the Quin Gold to the ultramarine blue. And then I am actually going to get a little more of the Quin Gold out so I can vary it that way too if I want to have it be a little yellower. And so basically massing trees together when they are in the distance, you get the idea, or the viewer will get the idea, that there are trees back there, but they don't have to see every branch or every individual tree. Okay, just finish these guys up. And then as this one is drying, I'm going to go over to the aspen, and I will show you some on that. And then I may have to dry this with a blow dryer if it's not quite dry enough when I get back over there. All right, and there's a little bit right there. So now I have that line of trees in the background, and there's a little variety of color. It would have to dry, and then I might add another layer if I need to in order to show shadow on those trees if I can see the shadow, if that would make sense for that image. You may only need to put in the first layer if you have your color dark enough, and then you may not have to do anything more with it. And depending on the size of your painting and all of that, I probably could have even gone with a smaller brush. But I could come back in. Let me find my smaller guy here. I was using a number 10, I believe, or this might be my, yeah, this is my number 16. I use the Silver Black Velvet series. I really like those brushes. And then this is, I think, a 4. Yeah, it's a 4. And so if you're doing a really small painting like this, you might use it for the tops of your trees so that it makes those tops have the right perspective and dimension. Some of the brush strokes that I had on these guys is a little wide, and with it being that far in the distance and on a small painting like this, it would make sense to use a smaller brush for the tops of the trees. So if these are still damp, it's kind of nice to put it in with the bigger brush and get the color across your area, but then if the area is still slightly wet, you could come back with a smaller brush and just adjust some of those edges so that they don't look too wide back there. Okay, so there's that one. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to clean off my palette a little bit over in here and pull out some of my yellow for the aspen. And when you're doing deciduous trees, the trees that drop their leaves in the fall, I tend to do several layers on them, but they are again a tree or a shape or a foliage that you can mass their leaves together, and you don't have to paint each tree individually in order for it to look like a forest of trees. So I'm going to pull out my New Gamboge, which is a warm yellow. It leans toward orange. And then I will get out some of my Aureolin yellow, which is a cooler yellow, and some cobalt blue. And that cobalt will be used in order to mix a green yellow, because there's not really much green left in those aspen, but I do see a little bit. And for this, I left out the evergreen tree that's in the foreground and all of that. I'm just going to show you the leaves for the aspen. And pull my blue over. All right. And then I'm going to start on, I usually start from the left and move toward the right, so that's what I will do. There's a couple things you can do. You could, if this were a bigger painting, I think I've talked about this in another painting, you could spritz with a water bottle that you can adjust the nozzle, because when you use an adjustable nozzle spray bottle, it gives you bigger and smaller drops. And if you spritz the tree area, if you're doing a larger painting, then it will leave drops of water on the paper, and you can use those drops of water. And I'm actually going to be doing a video later talking about how to use your spray bottle for some techniques with watercolor. And so if you want to watch that video at some point when I get it done. But for this, because it's small enough, I'm just going to place the color on. And I'll start with my New Gamboge. I'm going to go with the warmer color. And because this is the lighter value in this painting, if I was putting in all of the greens from the evergreens, I would be doing exactly what I'm doing here. I would start with the lighter leaves, and I would probably leave openings like I'm doing, so that it feels like either the light is shining through or that some of the evergreen foliage behind there could peek through as well. And it is nice on your trees to not have your trunks be basically with no leaves across them. And so I will break up the line of the trunk and have the trunk kind of disappear behind the leaves here and there when I'm painting deciduous trees. So I'll just continue across. You might change your or your color here and there, and it might have a little more orange to the leaves. They might be a little more green. And so basically I'm just working that shape across the whole thing and just adjusting my color here and there. Whoops, I went a little greener than what I'm seeing, but that's okay. And I'll just keep going. Now you could break this up into groups if for some reason you didn't want parts of your tree color for your aspen or whatever deciduous tree that you're painting. If you didn't want it to blur together, you could have 2 or 3 trees that you paint, and then you could paint around. Maybe you have a foreground tree or a tree that's a little bit different color that you don't want it to blur with the others. So you could break it up, but I find generally that I get enough variation and interest by just doing it this way, that this is how I generally do it. Okay, so I'm going to grab a little more Aureolin yellow and a touch of the green. You do need to be careful when you're painting across or around, say, a trunk, or maybe I had an evergreen tree that I was putting some aspen around. I would look for the same color. If I had a big evergreen right here, I would want to have some of the warm yellow over on the other side of the evergreen, possibly, depending on how big the tree is or where it's located, so that it feels like that tree is behind the evergreen, and that your color your color variation or colors makes sense going behind, and you don't have just like yellow and then green and then a different color, so that it all makes sense that way. And I'm just using the tip of my brush right now, and this is called scumbling, where I'm basically just sort of making random marks. You could, if you have a tree that seems a little more solid and you didn't want to worry about putting in little openings, you literally can just paint big shapes. So there's nothing to say that one way is necessarily the right way, and it's the way you end up painting the tree that you see in front of you and your style of painting. So this is just the way I like to do it, and it does remind me later to come back when I leave openings, to come back and put some green from the background trees in here and there. Okay, so I will finish these guys up. Now, when I'm painting trees like this, I generally do the first pass, and then, and actually I need a little bit of some warmer color. This tree over here is redder than some of the other ones, so I'm going to go ahead and get out some Quin Rose. What I was saying is that I will do the first pass of color like this, and then I may do either a second pass with the same kind of technique where I'm using my brush to do it, or I might use a sea sponge, and you wet the sea sponge, and then you can put it in your color and use the sea sponge to sort of stamp color onto the tree, and that will give you little leaf-like shapes, and you have to kind of find the sea sponge that works for the shapes and size, I guess, of the shapes that you want. And then you can do that. You could use a spray bottle with a little bit of color in it and spritz the color on. I've also seen paintings where it looked like they took a toothbrush and they dipped the toothbrush in some color and then spritz the color on with the toothbrush. So there's a variety of ways that you can add texture to leaves that are in the background. As they come forward, then you might start having bigger shapes, and some of those techniques may not make sense, and that might be more saving bigger areas of leaves with masking fluid or painting leaves on as a bigger shape. And okay, so I have the color there, and I'm going to go back over to this one. This is a little damp still, so I don't want to put any color over it just yet, because then it will start possibly causing blooms or blurring or whatever. So I'm going to go ahead and dry this, and then I'll show you what I'm going to do next. So I went ahead and dried all 3 of them. This one is probably still a little damp, but it's not bad. So what I was talking about over here is that the background trees back here become a shape. So I'm not going to paint individual trees. I'm going to go back to the color mix I had, which was the ultramarine blue with some Quin Gold and some burnt sienna in it. And I am going to pull out more burnt sienna. And then this time, because I already have my tone for the lighter part of the background down, I need to go with the darker value. So I'm going to use more of those colors, and I think I have enough green over here that I can bring a little bit over, and that green was made from ultramarine and the Quin Gold earlier, so I was just grabbing more of it and using it with my ultramarine and then putting some burnt sienna with it. So then I'm going to go back, and I'm thinking of that background shadow that's at the top, and excuse me, there are just a little bit of some kind of fuzzy edges or slightly broken edges. They're not too straight because it's hitting the tops of those trees back there and creating a little rough edge to it. And then I'm going to go to the right, and I'm looking at my bottom edge of this shape because that's where the tops of the trees in front of that shape are. And so I don't want it straight. I want it to have a little bit of some variation to it. And probably if I were painting this again, I would choose colors that are slightly grayer, purple maybe, not so green back there. But that's just looking at it some more, and that's why doing small paintings like this can be very helpful before you do your larger painting, because you can kind of get an idea if you're liking the color, if you like the process you're using, or if you want to do something different. And it's not a big time commitment because it's just a little small study. Alright, so then I'm going to continue down, and I'm looking for a little breaks in the shapes now. And the other thing I'm going to do before these edges dry is I'm going to come up here with a smaller brush with just a little bit of water on it, and I am going to start blurring some of those edges where I can. I'm not necessarily going to try to blur every edge, but just placing a little clear water next to those shapes will start to fuzz some of them. Now you can wait, and you could do this kind of thing with a brush after your paint is dry, but if my paint is dry enough, it's not real shiny right now. In fact, it's barely got any shine to it at all. It's just a little, just a touch shiny looking. Then I can come in and soften those edges just a little. And that way, that will push the color that I'm putting on, or not the color, the shape. It'll soften the edge and push it into the background. So you want your harder edged shapes in the foreground, not in the background, especially when it's this far back. Alright, and then as I come forward, I'm going to take some clear water, and I'm just going to dot it around on here. And then as I'm painting down in this section, the water that I'm dotting on right now will act like what I was just doing with the brush, but it's already there. So as I touch next to that water, it creates hard and soft edges. So it's helping me place the paint on the paper with a little bit of a random edge then, and it also will soften edges where the color doesn't quite go to the full extent of that water droplet that I place on there. And it is a little more random, so if you don't want it to be too random, then you might just want to paint it on like I did up here and then soften with a brush later. Alright, so I'm going to finish getting some of that color in. And again, I'm painting around this tree, but because it's darker, it doesn't necessarily matter, except that that tree is a little more vibrant in color. So I wouldn't necessarily want to neutralize the color that will eventually go on here. So if I put some color on there prior to painting that tree, then it might change what that tree looks like. The other way that you could do something like this in the background is if you're using a color that is granulating, and that's one where you see little dots of paint when you're applying the paint, and then when it dries there's a little texture to it. Granulating colors can add to the feeling of distant trees. So if I had, which I didn't plan on, but if I had used some of my colors that are a little more granulating, and ultramarine is a granulating color, but partly because I painted this on dry paper. When you paint something on wet paper, you will see more of the granulation generally, because it causes the, with the water on the paper already, it causes the heavier parts of the pigment to drop to the surface a little more, and then as it's drying you will see that granulation a little more. I added just a touch more dark down here because I want it to really make this line of trees back here stand out. So before I'm done with that one, I'm going to go over and add a little more to the aspen that are over here, and then I will come back to this one. So go back to my two yellows, the New Gamboge, the Aureolin, and my Cobalt. And I'm just going to come in, same technique as I used before. And so now I'm going to leave some of that yellow, lighter yellow peeking through, and I'll do some additional texture on top of those shapes that I already have down there. And vary it again a little bit. I'm going to add just a touch of the warm red, or not warm red, my Quin Rose with the New Gamboge to create a warm red, and add that up in here as well. And then, so I would work across the trees that way and just slowly build another layer. And that will give texture to the trees back there. Depending on how far back your deciduous trees are, you may only need that first coat. And just having some variety of color in there, if they were farther back, like over in this painting, there's some on the hillside right up in here. And I can paint them on. They are just little patches of color, and those areas, this is all I would do with that. And so I'll let that dry, and actually, yeah, so there's a few places on here that I can see a few aspen peeking through the evergreen, and maybe a little bit up in here. And because that's the lighter color, or lighter value, I would do that and then let it dry. Alright, so I am going to, I think I will zoom in a little bit. I don't think you need to see my palette anymore so that you can see the painting more. I will go ahead and zoom in just a touch. So I'll be right back. So I am going to go ahead and put a little more color on the aspen. This is still getting dry. It's not quite there. And so you could, depending on how you want to create these, you could keep going back and adding color. The last thing I'll show you on those, let me get a piece of paper here. I'm going to turn, I just want to protect the paintings over here. I'm going to use a toothbrush, and if I were doing this on my actual painting, I'd probably have to block off other parts of the painting to make sure I didn't end up with color where I don't want it. And then I'm kind of loading up the brush. If the color is too wet, it's not going to work as well, and mine is pretty wet, so we'll see. And then I can just, I use the brush upside down. It's not showing really well. And then I can just slowly flick the color on, and I usually will twist and turn it so that I get a variety of shape, that it doesn't all spray off one way or the other. And I got a lot that dropped right here. I'm going to lift that back, and as I don't know if you can see on the video, but it kind of sprayed off in other directions. So that's why you'd want to protect the other parts of your painting. And one way to do that is to take some tracing paper, when your painting is dry, lay it on there and just kind of follow the shapes with pencil, and then cut out where you want to spritz the paint with a toothbrush. Dry throat. Okay, so lastly over here, this one, let me pull the image back up. This one has some trees that are still in the background. They are warmer than the background color, and they have a highlighted top edge to them. And so I'm going to use my Quin Gold, and I'm using it in a sort of muted fashion because I had some the ultramarine blue still sort of sitting over here, so I'm not using a very vibrant mix of it yet. The most vibrant part of this painting is the green that's down on the grassy parts, and I can put some of that in as well. And so as you come forward in a painting or in a landscape, generally your color, your green color will get warmer. So those cooler colors will recede in the image. Okay, so I will finish putting this in there, and then the bottom edge, and I could literally have painted that, if I was thinking about it, I could literally have painted that across the whole area. I didn't have to stop at the top, because the bottom edge is going to go darker. Okay, so then I'm going to go back to the ultramarine blue, and I'll put a little bit of that burnt sienna in it because this area is still on the more muted side. It's darker. And then I'm putting this on while this area is wet because I want it to blur together, create the shadow or the darker part of the bottom edge of those trees, or the trees that are in shadow on that side. And then as I come across, and I think I'm going to go just a touch darker even. Remember, your watercolor is going to dry 20 to 30% lighter than how you apply it. So that would dry probably too light. Okay. So now, as I come forward, I will show you just a touch of the color on the land there, and then I will finish up this video. If I were doing a video where I was showing you the whole landscape, then I would keep going, but the videos can get long, and I have other things I need to be doing as well. Alright, so I'm using Aureolin and some cobalt. You could use lemon yellow, or I have Hansa yellow on my palette instead of lemon. So it is pretty yellowy green, and there are situations where this color might look too over the top yellow-green, and I'm not worrying about where the trees are necessarily in here right now because this is just a little study. So if I were going to do, and in fact those trees are darker anyway. Okay, so I'm just giving you an idea of the vibrant color that can be added as you're coming into the foreground. And that's sand right there. We have a lot of smoke. I'm in Colorado, and we have a lot of smoke in our state right now, and I notice my throat is very dry this afternoon, and I sound a little congested from it. Okay, so I'm going to pull that down into here. Some of this in here is in shadow, but so you can see the kind of variation of green as I'm coming forward. So then the foreground trees would be darker in general than the land there, and I'm not going to put in those foreground trees, but I will put in just a little bit of the water because it's kind of fun to have that there, and it is just slightly on the purple side of cobalt. So I'm using cobalt and a little bit of my Quin Rose, and I am hopefully not going to touch the green of the land, because then we'll have blue in the vibrant grass color that I just placed. So normally I would be coming up right next to my land, and so this is more just for the color of it. Oops, and there's a little island right in here that I didn't even see when I was drawing it. Okay, finish up. There's some trees down here that I'm going around. All right, so it's pretty quickly gives you an idea if you're going to like those colors, and then if your process, if you're liking that, and if that's working. And so those are different ways that you can do background trees. You can think of them as shapes, basically, that you're putting in shadows, and you just want some texture in that shape. You're not painting individual trees. There are some dots and things back here that will give the idea that those are trees, especially when I would put in this foreground tree, then all of a sudden the viewer is going to go, oh, those are trees that are farther back, and it would make more sense. This one is showing you how you can paint trees that are maybe a little closer to you, and they can become just one big shape as long as you're giving them the correct shape at the top of the tree. Then it will read as a grouping of trees back there, and then you can see the mass of aspen in the background and the way distance are just shapes. And then this one is a little closer to the viewer, and you might see some individual texture of leaves, and but you can still put in those trees the general shape of them as one big area of color at the same time, and then you can come back and add some more texture to it by successive layers. So I hope that was helpful to see how you might do some distant trees and paint those in, and I will keep creating these videos, and if you have a tip, trick, or technique that you would like to see in watercolor, please leave a comment below, and I hope you have a good day. Bye for now.